I stood at my father's funeral and listened to a stranger tell me he wasn't my father at all. Not cruelly, not to hurt me. An old family friend, a man I'd met maybe twice in my life, put his hand on my shoulder in the receiving line and said, "Your dad, God, the things that man did for you." Not many men would raise another man's daughter alone for 15 years like that and never say a word about it. I remember asking him to repeat it. I thought I'd misheard. I hadn't misheard. I had just never known. 15 years. My whole life, minus the 3 years before he came into it. And in all that time, my father, the only father I had ever known, the man who taught me to ride a bike and sat up with me through every fever and walked me down an aisle 4 years ago, never once told me I wasn't his. I want to tell you what I found out after that funeral, because I think I finally understand a man I thought I already knew completely. My mother died when I was 3. I don't remember her, not really, just fragments, the smell of a particular soap, a lullaby I couldn't place until I was much older and heard it again in a grocery store and had to leave my cart in the aisle because I was crying too hard to finish shopping. My father, the man I called my father my entire life, whose name was Richard, married my mother when I was 2 years old. I learned this part later, at the funeral and after, piecing it together from people who'd known him longer than I had. He wasn't my biological father. My biological father had left before I was even born, and Richard had married my mother knowing that, loving her enough to take on a daughter that wasn't his by blood before that daughter could even form a single memory of him not being there. When my mother died a year later, Richard didn't hesitate, from what I've since learned. He didn't call my biological father. He didn't look for someone else to take responsibility. He simply became my father, full stop, no asterisk, no explanation given to a toddler who couldn't have understood one anyway. And then, as far as I can tell, he made a decision that shaped the next 15 years of both our lives. He decided I would never know any different. I grew up the ordinary way a loved child grows up. Richard packed my lunches. He learned to French braid hair badly, and then less badly, from a library book he never told me he'd checked out until I found it years later, dog-eared to the same 3 pages. He came to every school play, sat in a folding chair in a gymnasium too many times to count, always in the same spot, 3rd row, aisle seat, because it made it easier for him to slip out if I looked nervous backstage and needed him. He never remarried. I used to ask him why, as a kid, the way kids ask blunt questions without understanding the weight of them. He always said the same thing. "I already got the best part of my life, sweetheart. I got you." I thought that was just a father being sentimental. I didn't know, until the funeral, how literally he meant it. Looking back now, there are so many small things I've had to re-see. The way you look at an old photograph and suddenly notice a detail you walked past 100 times before. I remember being maybe 8 years old, at a family reunion on his side, and overhearing an aunt say something to another relative. "It's remarkable, really, what he's doing for that little girl." And my father walking into the room at exactly that moment and the conversation stopping cold, the way conversations do when adults decide a child shouldn't hear the rest of something. I asked him about it in the car on the way home. He told me I'd misheard, that they were talking about a school fundraiser he'd helped organize. I believed him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was my father. Fathers don't lie about things like that. I understand now he wasn't really lying, not in the way I mean it now. He was protecting a promise he must have made to himself, maybe even to my mother before she died, though I'll never know that for certain. A promise that I would never grow up feeling like an obligation, or a burden, or a kindness someone had extended to me instead of a love someone simply had for me. There were other moments, once I started collecting them after the funeral. A form I found in his desk when I was helping clear out his house. An old adoption paperwork file, formally making him my legal father when I was 5, something I never knew had even been necessary, something he'd handled quietly, through a lawyer, and never once mentioned. A savings account, opened the year my mother died, that he'd contributed to every single month for 18 years, that funded my college without a single loan, that I always assumed was just Dad being careful with money. Never once realizing the account had been opened specifically, deliberately, the week after her funeral, before he'd even fully processed his own grief. Because he was already thinking about a future for a 3-year-old that wasn't biologically his responsibility to think about at all. I used to think my father was simply a steady man, a quiet man. I didn't understand, until it was too late to tell him I understood, that steadiness like that isn't just personality. Sometimes it's a 15-year act of will, chosen new every single morning, that a person simply never talks about because talking about it was never the point. I want to tell you about the one time, as a teenager, I actually asked him directly, because I think about this conversation more than almost any other memory I have of him now. I was 15, going through the particular cruelty teenagers sometimes direct at the people who love them most. And in the middle of an argument about something I don't even remember anymore, I said something I regretted the moment it left my mouth. You're not even my real dad anyway. I don't fully know, even now, where that sentence came from. I don't think I even believed it. I think it was just the cruelest thing a 15-year-old brain could locate in a moment of anger. A weapon grabbed without checking what it actually was. His face didn't do what I expected. I expected anger, maybe hurt that flashed and disappeared the way hurt does in an argument. Instead, he went very quiet, and something moved behind his eyes that I didn't have the emotional vocabulary at 15 to properly read. No, he said finally, just that. No, I'm not. And then he left the room. Not dramatically. He just said he needed some air, and he went and sat on the porch for almost an hour alone, while I sat inside feeling the particular shame of a teenager who said something true-shaped but cruel and doesn't yet know how to take it back. He never brought that conversation up again. Not once in the 15 years, the 14 years, I suppose, that followed. I apologized the next morning, awkwardly, the way teenagers apologize. And he hugged me and said, "We're okay, sweetheart," and that was the end of it as far as I ever knew. I understand now that he wasn't agreeing with the cruelty in what I'd said. He was confirming a fact he'd decided, 15 years earlier, would never define what we actually were to each other. No, I'm not your biological father, true. But I don't think he ever once, in his own heart, considered that the same thing as not being my real dad. I think that sentence cost him something on that porch that he never once let me see the price of. He died 6 weeks ago. Heart failure, quick, the doctors told me, though I don't think anything about losing your father ever actually feels quick. The funeral was larger than I expected. People I didn't recognize, co-workers from a job he'd retired from a decade earlier, neighbors from 3 different houses we'd lived in over the years, a woman who introduced herself as his college roommate's widow, people whose connection to him I couldn't always place. It was in the receiving line, exhausted, shaking hands I didn't fully register, that Mr. Alders, the old family friend, someone my father had known since before I was even born, apparently, took my hand in both of his and said the sentence that split my understanding of my own life into a clear before and after. Your dad, God, the things that man did for you. Not many men would raise another man's daughter alone for 15 years like that and never say a word about it. I asked him what he meant. I remember my voice sounding strange to my own ears, too calm for what I was actually feeling. He looked stricken, immediately, the way people look when they realize they've said something they assumed was already known. "I'm so sorry," he said. I assumed you knew. Richard adopted you. Your biological father left before you were born. Richard never once let anyone treat you like you weren't fully his. I just assumed after all these years that you knew the whole story. I want to tell you I handled that moment gracefully. I didn't. I excused myself from my own father's receiving line and stood in a hallway outside the funeral home restroom and cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was small enough for him to pick me up and carry me to bed. Not because I felt any less like his daughter. If anything, the opposite. Everything he had ever done suddenly reorganized itself in my memory into something far larger than I had understood it to be. The French braid book, the savings account, the porch, and the words, "No, I'm not," that I finally, 15 years too late, understood the full weight of. I cried because I would never get to ask him why. I would never get to tell him that I understood now, completely, what it had cost him to give me an entirely ordinary childhood, uncomplicated by a truth he'd carried alone for 15 years, so that I would never have to carry it at all. There was no one left to reckon with. That's the particular cruelty of finding this out after a funeral instead of before one. I couldn't call him. I couldn't sit across a kitchen table and ask him the question that kept me awake for the first 3 nights after. Why didn't you tell me? Was it to protect me? Or was it, somehow, to protect yourself from watching my face change the way his had once changed on a porch, all those years ago? I've had to reckon, instead, with an empty chair, and with the box of paperwork I found while clearing out his house, and with a stack of cards he'd apparently written me every single birthday since I was 3 years old and never sent, kept instead in a shoebox in his closet, cards that said things like, "Watching you grow up has been the greatest privilege of my life, even though I know I didn't earn the right to it the ordinary way. And someday, if it's ever the right moment. I want you to know the whole story. I just haven't found the right moment yet, and every year, I love you too much to risk it being the wrong one." 15 birthdays of cards, 15 years of not yet. He was still writing them the year before he died. I sat on the floor of his closet with that shoebox for almost 2 hours, reading every single one, understanding for the first time that his silence had never been secrecy. It had been a kind of devotion, so total it never needed permission or acknowledgement to be real. I think, if I could reckon with him directly, I would tell him this. I understand now why you never told me. And I forgive you completely for a debt I didn't even know I was owed an explanation for, because I finally understand the explanation was never really missing. It was written down, every single year, waiting for a moment you never quite found the courage to choose. It's been 6 weeks. I still reach for my phone some evenings to call him before I remember. I found my biological father's name in that same box of paperwork. A man I have no memory of, no relationship with, no particular need to seek out, though I haven't fully ruled it out either, someday, carefully, on my own timeline. But he isn't the story I needed to understand. Richard is. Richard always was. I've started telling people the whole story now, the way Mr. Alders assumed I already knew it. Not because I need anyone's validation of what my father was to me. I've never needed that. But because I think he deserved, finally, for someone to say it out loud on his behalf, since he spent 15 years making sure it was never said out loud at all. I kept that shoebox of unsent cards. I read one every year now, on my birthday, instead of all 15 at once. I think that's closer to how he would have wanted it. 1 year, 1 card, one quiet piece of a truth he was always planning to give me eventually, just never quite found the right moment for. I don't think I needed the truth to know he was my father, completely, in every way that ever actually mattered. But I'm glad, in the end, that I got it anyway. It didn't change who he was to me. It just finally showed me the size of what he'd been carrying, alone, the entire time. If you've ever loved someone whose sacrifice you didn't fully understand until it was too late to thank them for it, I want you to hear this. Some debts are so quiet the person paying them never even asks to be repaid. They just keep showing up, year after year, and hope that showing up was always going to be enough. This has been the unseen debt. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. Is there someone in your life whose full sacrifice you only understood after it was too late to say thank you? We'll be back next week with another story someone needed to finally tell.